Welcome, focused learners, to this Academic Explainer. Today, we are diving right into Module 17, English Grammar, Clause Types, and Allocutory Force. We're going to play the role of linguistic detectives today, diving deep into the absolute mechanics of English grammar. We'll be drawing on the rigorous frameworks established by some of the most prominent linguistic scholars out there to completely unpack how the words we say are sometimes totally different from what we actually mean. Grab your mental notepads, because class is officially in session. Here is a quick look at our syllabus for today's masterclass. First, syntax versus pragmatics. Then, the mechanics of assertion, followed by the expression of emphasis. After that, we'll look at strategies of disagreement, and finally wrap up with pedagogical implications. Let's get right to it. Okay, Section 1. Syntax versus pragmatics. Let's dive into this. So to really get a grip on English grammar, we have to establish a core divide. Think of syntax as the structural rules of the game. English traditionally gives us four major structural clause types: declarative, interrogative, exclamatory, and imperative. That's just the framework. But then we have pragmatics. This is all about the illocutionary force. And as foundational scholars like Levinson point out, illocutionary force is the actual, semantic, and pragmatic job an utterance does in a highly specific, real-world context. Basically, syntax is what a sentence looks like on paper. Illocutionary force is what that sentence actually does in the real world. And here's a perfect example of that split in action. Take a sentence like, "You're ready." Structurally, syntactically, it's a standard declarative clause, subject, then verb. Prototypically, it makes a statement, right? But what if I just pitch my voice up at the end and say, "You're ready?" The syntax hasn't changed one single bit, but practically, pragmatically, it is completely transformed into a question. That rising intonation, what we call a suprasegmental feature, literally cancels my commitment to the truth of the statement. I'm no longer telling you a fact. I'm asking you to confirm one. All right, moving on to Section 2, the mechanics of assertion.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand the difference between a statement and an assertion. A statement, that's just a semantic concept. It's a proposition floating out there that can be evaluated objectively as either true or false. But an assertion, while grammarians like Huddleston and Pullum have extensively analyzed this as a deeply pragmatic category, making an assertion requires the speaker to step up and take actual responsibility for the validity of the information. It's the difference between a sentence sitting in a vacuum and a real human being firmly standing behind the truth of those words.
Usually, the standard vehicle for making an assertion is the declarative clause, but speakers hijack this basic declarative structure all the time to do completely different things. How? Well, basically through three main factors. First up, performative verbs. If I say, "I promise not to tell," the very act of speaking is the promise itself. Second, modal auxiliaries. If I tell you, "You must come in immediately," that is syntactically a declarative statement, but that little word "must" forces it to function pragmatically as a command. And third, as we just saw, intonation and punctuation. A quick question mark or a vocal inflection can instantly turn a confident assertion into an inquiry.
We also have to navigate some tricky syntactic constraints when we deal with assertions. Scholars like Quirk and Greenbaum have beautifully mapped out what happens in non-assertive contexts, like questions or negative sentences. "He has been to Paris" is a strictly assertive context. But the moment we flip it to a non-assertive context, like asking a question, we actually must introduce specific lexical items to stay grammatically correct. We can't just ask the exact same phrase. We have to ask, "Has he ever been to Paris?" Words like ever, any, or yet are vital grammatical gears that literally only turn in these non-assertive environments.
Which brings us to Section 3, the expression of emphasis. Now, what's really interesting about this is how raw emotion overrides neutral grammar. When we want to express an extreme position on a scale of value, we rely on formal exclamatives. Notice the phrasing here. What a time we've had today. We take WH elements like what or how and shove them right to the absolute front of the clause for maximum prominence. And what's syntactically fascinating is that, unlike a regular question, we do not invert the subject and the operator. The what acts as a predeterminer, indicating a super high degree of value. It gives the sentence immense emotive weight without ever becoming a question.
Emphasis also sneaks into our imperatives. In British English particularly, a positive imperative can be made incredibly insistent or extremely polite by slapping a heavily stressed do right before the verb. Do have some more tea. Historically, linguists have noted this is often associated with female speech patterns, functioning as a way to strongly reinforce the positive, welcoming sense of a directive. It makes the command feel way less like an order and a lot more like a warm, inescapable invitation.
We can also use what linguists call emphatic operators. Think about a totally neutral delivery. I'm sorry. It gets the job done. Now contrast that with the emphatic version. I am sorry. By uncontracting the verb and heavily stressing the auxiliary operator am, the speaker injects a massive dose of personal conviction, enthusiasm, or even reproach. The underlying grammar doesn't change a bit, but the emotional volume is dialed all the way up.
To precisely scale this emotive intensity, English actually relies on a complex taxonomy of degree adverbs. Linguist Douglas Biber and his colleagues famously categorize these. First, we have amplifiers which scale things upwards. These include maximizers, denoting the absolute upper extreme, like completely or utterly, and boosters, denoting a high degree, like deeply. On the flip side, we have downtoners, which have a lowering effect. Think approximators, like almost, or minimizers, like hardly. The choice of intensifier is highly subjective, basically allowing speakers to perfectly dial in the exact gradient of their emotion.
Moving right along to Section 4, Strategies of Disagreement. Let's look at conversational friction. Let's be real. Direct disagreement can be socially abrasive. It's super rare for someone to just casually say, I object to your proposal. Instead, English speakers are absolute masters of indirect objection. We navigate friction by cushioning the blow. First, we start with a discourse marker, a conversational shock absorber, like, well, actually, or as a matter of fact. Then, we deliver the objection, but we apply the primary intonational stress directly onto the negative auxiliary. So it sounds like this, well, actually, I don't think it is a good idea. This softens the interpersonal clash while leaving absolutely no doubt about the pragmatic disagreement.
Another brilliant, high-drama conversational strategy is the echo question. Imagine someone says, I am marrying Jim. An objecting listener might respond by repeating the structure but replacing the contested information with a heavily stressed interrogative. You're marrying whom? Let's be honest, this isn't really a request for information. They heard the name perfectly well. Pragmatically, it is a pure expression of sheer disbelief, and it totally functions as a prelude to a massive argument.
And finally, Section 5, Pedagogical Implications. Let's see how this actually applies in the classroom.
Teaching these concepts reveals some really fascinating cross-linguistic challenges, particularly for Spanish learners of English. As we've seen, English relies incredibly heavily on those supersegmental factors, like stress and intonation, to change pragmatics without touching the syntax. Spanish, however, often uses completely different word orders or specific lexical fillers to achieve those exact same effects. Furthermore, mastering the strict rules of assertive versus non-assertive items, knowing exactly when you have to swap some for any, requires a ton of practice. The big pedagogical takeaway here is vital. We absolutely cannot just teach the grammatical form, we have to explicitly teach the pragmatic function and the intonation that brings it to life.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how syntax provides the skeleton, but pragmatics, context, and intonation provide the actual heartbeat of language. So I leave you with this final thought to ponder today. When you speak, how often do you actually rely on your intonation rather than your perfect syntax to convey what you really mean? Pay attention to your next conversation. The answer might just surprise you. Thanks for focusing in with us, and keep learning.